person in the Ummah to lead, and instead of making this an Ummah-wide conflict on a political level, and this is very cynical to talk about, but politics is cynical, as we'll see, we allow now for a small subset of powerful families to fight out who's going to be the rulers, who are going to be the ones that have to defend the borders, who are going to be the ones that have to make these very ugly, difficult political decisions when it comes to managing this massive state. And we allow the rest of the Ummah to detach a little bit from that. And as people coming out of a democratic or some kind of a society with an ideal of democracy on some level, that rubs us the wrong way. We don't like that idea of saying that not everybody is involved. But when we look at the history of how politics unfolds in this Ummah, then there's a little bit of comfort that comes from that idea of knowing that not everybody has to be involved with what are ultimately messy politics, as it always is. So that's just a little bit of a spiel leading into the Umayyads. We're not going to go into too much detail about the rule of Umayyad Khalifas. Most of that is going to be take part in the era of the Sahaba. And the Umayyads are going to be strict rulers. They're going to be harsh kings, as the Prophet ﷺ predicted would follow after the Khulafat Rashidun. And there's a great Imam who says, he talks about the fact that when we think about the Umayyads, we tend to think of them a little bit more critically than we do of the other dynasties. And he says it's not that the Umayyads did anything worse than any of the dynasties that came after them. The Abbasids and the Seljuks and the Mamluks and the Ottomans, they all did some pretty harsh things at times. It's who they were doing it to. They were doing this to Sahaba. They fought Sahaba. They oppressed Sahaba. They even killed Sahaba at times. And that's a difficulty that we really have to struggle with. Right? We love the Sahaba, but these are the people that are going to lead the Ummah and extend the borders of this empire that's stretching out. They're going to do many, many great things, but we're always going to have in our hearts that hurt, that they also did some bad things. Not just some bad things, but just some bad things to people we love so much. That's just a part of what it means to be a Muslim trying to understand our history. So the Umayyads formed the first ruling dynasty of the Muslim Ummah. And again, this is a quick history. This whole series that we're doing is a quick history. We can't give time to the full discussion that we would want to, inshallah. There are 14 Umayyad Khalifas. Very quickly, the line moves from Muawiyah, the companion of the Prophet ﷺ, radiallahu anhu, to his son Yazid, who there's very little forgiveness for in this Ummah. Yazid is ultimately responsible for a number of terrible crimes in the Ummah, but most egregious among them is the killing of the Prophet's grandson, Al-Hussein. After Yazid, it goes to his son, whose name is Muawiyah, after his father. His son is young, and he's maybe 19. He's a very sickly person. He's Khalifa for just over a year, and then he dies. At that point, there's a succession crisis, but ultimately a tabi'i, a man who's kind of in between the categories of a companion of the Prophet ﷺ and somebody who followed the companions, because technically he saw the Prophet ﷺ when he was very young. His name is Marwan ibn al-Hakam. He's another member of the Umayyad family. He's going to take the Khilafah away from the line of Muawiyah and root it firmly in his line. One of his arguments is, he says, after Yazid, this line should not be in power even in the Umayyad dynasty. After what was done, after the things that occurred there, we have to pull this away. Right? His name is Marwan ibn al-Hakam, and his son is named Malik ibn Marwan. I'm saying these names because we're not going to go into details about who these people are, but these are very important names in the history of Islam. Particularly Malik ibn Marwan. Malik ibn Marwan is the only Khalifa who after him had 4 sons become Khalifa. All 4 of his sons, one after another, will become Khalifa, and there'll be 2 of them, and then one of their cousins, his nephew, and then 2 more of his sons. Okay? And this family is going to have a huge impact on the development of the Ummah. Abdul Malik ibn Marwan is the one who builds Qubat al-Sakhra, the Dome of the Rock. He goes to Jerusalem, where Masjid al-Aqsa is, and he builds this masjid that we all know, that we all love and recognize immediately. He builds it over the rock that the Prophet ﷺ stood on when he made his Mi'raj journey into Jannah. And he builds it in a particular way, and this brings us back to the history that we started off this lecture series talking about, the history of the Middle East as a land of a battleground between the 2 greatest empires in the world, the Persian Empire and the Roman Empire. And he chooses to build Qubat al-Sakhra in Jerusalem, right in the middle of that old battleground between these 2 great empires. This is after the Muslims have conquered the Persians. They've conquered half of the Roman Empire. They've unified all of this land now under one rule. And he builds Qubat al-Sakhra, and he builds it in a particular way. He builds it with a golden dome, or actually, it wasn't originally golden, but he builds it with a dome. It was originally another color. And the body of the building is designed with this blue tile facade. It's an octagonal shape with this blue tile facade. The dome is the quintessential mark of Roman architecture. Romans were the first people to build domes. And it was always Roman buildings that were domed in the world before we were putting domes on masajid. Qubat al-Sakhra is the first masjid to have a dome placed on top of it. And it will remain the only masjid to have a dome on top of it for many, many years to come. And the blue tiled facade of the building is very iconic of Persian architecture. And so what he's doing is he builds this building as a sign of love for the Prophet ﷺ, as a sign of his commitment to Islam, as a sign of wanting to honor the 3rd holiest site in Islam, and as a symbol to the world that after all of these centuries, remember the Romans and the Persians were at war for 680 years. After all of these centuries of warfare between these 2 empires, the Muslims have arrived, they've conquered the Persians, they've conquered the Romans, and they are now uniting this civilization under one banner. And Qubat al-Sakhra is the unification, it's the symbol of the final unification of these 2 empires that have been warring with each other in the 3rd holiest site in the world as a masjid, built over the rock that the Prophet ﷺ stood on in this world to enter the next world. And this is Abdul Malik ibn Marwan who constructs that. The next Khalifa that we're going to give just a little bit of attention to, and we really should give so much more to, but for time we won't be able to do that, is, I mentioned he has 2 sons that come after him and then their nephew. Abdul Malik's brother is Abdul Aziz. Abdul Aziz's son is named Umar. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. He's one of the most famous Khalifas in Islamic history, even though he was only Khalifa for 2 years. He comes out of this, at this point, exceedingly wealthy, exceptionally powerful family, the Umayyad family. And he comes at a time when there's a lot of animosity for the Umayyads. From the beginning of the Umayyads, there's a lot of animosity within the Ummah toward the Umayyads. Nobody's really happy about the way that they came to power. Very few people are really happy about the way that they choose to govern the Ummah. And there are a number of problems that people have with the Umayyads as they go along. Namely, that the Umayyads start to develop a system in which Arabs are privileged over non-Arabs. Because now you have Islam spreading through all these lands. This is Arabia. This is where the Arabs live. Everywhere else it goes, it's going into worlds and kingdoms and civilizations that are decidedly non-Arab. Going into the Persian world, going into the Byzantine world, going into the Berber world in North Africa, going up into Central Asia. And so you have very quickly this explosion of non-Arab Muslim populations. Islam is spreading rapidly through all of these populations. And the Umayyads are an Arab tribe, and they choose to rule by putting Arabs in a certain situation of privilege within the society. Also, they develop some complicated practices when it comes to Islamic fiqh. And this starts to turn a lot of the scholars against them. One of the things that they start to do is they have, for the Umayyads, as just a standard law in Islam, you have jizya. Everybody who lives in America is aware of this discussion of jizya. It's a tax that's paid by non-Muslim populations in Muslim civilization to the government, right? There's a special tax that has to be paid, and we can't get into the discussion of that. The Umayyads rely heavily on this because most of the people that they are ruling are non-Muslim. The majority of the people that they rule are non-Muslim, even with the huge numbers of Muslim people that are coming to Islam. They rely on this tax that's coming in. But as more and more populations start to convert to Islam, they're starting to lose jizya. Right? They can't extract that tax from them. Or so everybody else would say. The Umayyads, in certain cases, they don't do this everywhere, but in certain areas, they say, no, we're going to keep applying jizya to these non-Arab populations that have become Muslim. So even after they become Muslim, they're still being charged this non-Muslim tax. And many people don't like that, and the ulama very quickly start to challenge the Umayyads on this position. Okay? So people don't like the fact that Arabs are being privileged over non-Arabs in this society. People don't like the fact that jizya is being forced on Muslim populations. And then in certain areas, the Umayyads go as far as to stop people from becoming Muslim. There's a famous event in the year 700 where a group of probably former Christians come to the Umayyad governor in the area of northern Syria. And they come in mass. It's a whole community of people. They no longer want to pay jizya, so they all go to the governor and they all take their shahada. And the governor actually refuses to accept their shahada and says, no, you guys are not joining the Muslim Ummah, you guys are not part of this community, and blocks them and rejects them. And the huge outcry goes up from the ulama, and the ulama handle it in their own ways, and inshallah those shahadas are accepted. But this becomes a huge crisis in the Umayyad world, and it starts to lead to more and more resentment toward that dynasty. So these are the conflicts that the Umayyads are starting to create in this world. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, let's go back to him. He becomes Khalifa at the peak of this era, and all of these issues are abounding throughout the Umayyad Khilafah. And he immediately goes against his family, which is a very difficult thing to do, even today. And he starts to change these policies. And within 2 years, he almost completely eradicates all of the policies that the Umayyads had established. And there's so much more that we could talk about in his personal life. Like I said, he's somebody coming out of a tremendous amount of wealth. When he got married, he marries his cousin, who is the daughter of the Khalifa, Malik. And their wedding goes on for 7 days, and as a gift from her father to her on their wedding, he gives her 7 palaces on the Euphrates River, and everyone who attends the wedding over this course of a week, which occupies the whole city of Damascus, everyone who attends leaves the wedding with gifts of gold. We give out, candles and candy, or some kind of giveaways at our parties. People were leaving there enriched with wealth. That's the kind of wealth that he's coming out of, right? He tells his wife immediately after their wedding, he says, if you want all of this, then all of this is available to you, but I'm not. And if you want me, then you have to be willing to give up all of this. People narrate that they remember seeing her in that wedding with all of the splendor of the bride who's the daughter of the Khalifa. And they remember seeing her when she's married to Umar ibn Abdul Aziz while he's the Khalifa a few years later. And she's buying onions from the marketplace by herself. Because as soon as he becomes Khalifa, Umar ibn Abdul Aziz says, I'm not going to take 1 penny from this ummah for myself. He lives in poverty as the Khalifa for 2 years, and then he passes away. Many people say, we talked about the number of Khalifa Rashidin, we talked about the number of the rightly guided Khalifas. We like to say there's 4, but if we include Hassan, as you technically should, there's 5. But if you're not including Hassan, as most people don't, it's not a problem. Many people give the title of the 5th Khalifa Rashid to Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, even though he comes from this dynasty that politically most of the Ummah has a lot of problems with. That's as much as we have time to say about Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. There are 14 Umayyad Khalifas in total. The Umayyads reign for 90 years. They go from the year, they end, I can't remember the starting date is, but 90 years before their ending date in 749, when you have the Abbasid revolution and the Abbasids come to power. And we'll look at that in more detail in a minute. Firstly, I want to talk, before we get to the rest of the lecture, I want to talk just a little bit about the geography of the now emerging Muslim world. Because it's really under the Umayyads that most of the expansion of the Muslim world is going to occur. Under the Abbasids, things will expand a little bit further. Namely, they'll go up a little bit further into the Turkic lands in Central Asia. We'll talk all about that in our next lecture. And they'll push a little bit further into Anatolia, into modern-day Turkey, this peninsula here between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. And they'll expand a little bit further south in Africa. Under the Ottomans, we'll get the rest of Anatolia and push up into Eastern Europe, this whole area of Bulgaria, and up into where it says the Avar Khanate in that area. Right? But for the most part, most of the Muslim Ummah is going to, and then of course, at the end of the Umayyads, we're going to start moving into India, Pakistan, modern-day Pakistan, down into the Indian subcontinent, and that's going to expand to the rest of the Indian subcontinent over the time of the Abbasids. But most of this expansion is occurring at this point, under the Umayyads. Right? And we're going to get pretty much the core, even if we look at this map, we're recognizing the core of the Muslim world countries that are still dominantly Muslim today. Right? And I'll just make a note here, we'll talk about it next time, that if you go over here to the Aral Sea in Central Asia, on this side of the map, it's very small. There's a river, you probably can't see it, it's in the green, it's right on that border of the Umayyad Empire. There's a river that comes down south out of the Aral Sea called the Amu Darya River. The Amu Darya River is a very important river in the history of Western civilization. The Romans called it the River Oxus, and they called everything on the other side of that river Transoxiana. All of Central Asia going into China, they called Transoxiana. It means the land on the other side of the River Oxus. The Persians, even before the Romans, would refer to everything on this side, on the western side of that river, as Irani Buzarg, which means the protected lands and the lands of the Aryans. Right? The Aryans are the Iranian people, and if that makes it sound like they're white supremacists, then there's a history to that as well, and which I'd love to go into, but I have to really hold myself back. So there's this conceptualization, both among the Romans and the Persians, both of these two great empires in the Western world, that there's something about this part of the world that sets it apart from everything on the other side of that river. And the Arabs continue this. This is a geographic imagination that has been around for centuries and centuries, from one empire to another. The Arabs will continue it, and they will refer to the Amu Darya River simply as an-Nahr. It becomes the river. Even though they have the Euphrates and the Tigris, they have the Nile, they have all these really significant rivers, they refer to this very small river in modern-day Turkmenistan as a Nahr. It has other names as well, but they would commonly refer to it as a Nahr. And they refer to everything on the other side of that river as ma wara an-Nahr. If you study anything about Islamic history, you'll hear this term over and over again. Ma wara an-Nahr. It's a region, and it means everything on the other side of the river. So there's this conceptualization of there's the land that's here, and there's the land that's just everything else is on the other side of that river. We'll talk more about this as we talk about the emergence of the Turkish people and their significant impact on Islam in our next lecture, inshallah. So this is the basic geography of the emerging Muslim world, and it happens mostly in the Umayyad period. I want to shift gears here a little bit and use this time to talk about the lives of 4 very significant figures in Islamic history. Everybody has heard something about Hanafis, Malikis, Shafi'is, Hanbalis. All of those madhahib that we have emerged that are still functioning very much alive and well in the Muslim Ummah today emerge from 4 people who all come out of generally the same era and who are called in Sunni Islam the great Imams. Imam Abu-Hanifa, Imam Malik ibn Anas, Imam al-Shafi'i, and Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. And they all live in this period that we're talking about today. Imam Abu Hanifa, actually I have something here. There we go. This is a chart showing various scholars and their connections. Imam Abu Hanifa comes from Kufa. And we talked before about the movement patterns of some of the Sahaba that are going to have an outsized significant impact on the formation of the rest of the Ummah. Abdullah bin Mas'ud, one of the closest companions of the Prophet ﷺ, one of the earliest converts to Islam, at the end of his life moves to Kufa when the Muslims have conquered Iraq. And he lives the rest of his life there, and he teaches, and he forms a school, and he teaches numerous students. The other Sahaba said that there was no one from among the companions of the Prophet ﷺ who had as large a body of students that were as in love with their teacher as the students of Abdullah bin Mas'ud. So Abdullah bin Mas'ud becomes a prolific teacher in Kufa, and the fiqh that he passes down to his students becomes the fiqh of the people of Iraq. And other companions that show up as notably as Abdullah bin Mas'ud are Abdullah bin Umar. Abdullah bin Umar mostly stays in the city of Medina, and he teaches the scholarly generation that's going to come after the companions in the city of Medina. And Abdullah bin Abbas is going to root himself in Mecca, and his students are going to come out of the population of the city of Mecca. So Mecca and Medina and Kufa are going to become the 3 centers of learning in the coming generations after the Prophet ﷺ, based on the teachings of these 3 companions. And even among the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, there are differences of opinion. Completely legitimate, acceptable differences of opinion. Sometimes those differences of opinion would occur in front of the Prophet ﷺ, and he wouldn't correct anyone, meaning he allowed for this idea of difference of opinion to emerge within his community while he was still alive. And so these companions have some differences of opinion when it comes to fiqh, when it comes to how to do such and such and such and such. And they pass that on to their students, and over time we get the development of these different schools. So what are these connections? Abdullah bin Mas'ud teaches among his many students a man named Alqama ibn Qais. Alqama ibn Qais is one of the greatest scholars to come out of the people of Iraq. Alqama ibn Qais is going to teach. I need to take a sip of water before I say all these ayns. Alqama ibn Qais is going to teach, among many other students, his nephew, Ibrahim al-Nakha'i. Ibrahim al-Nakha'i teaches a man named Hamad ibn Abi Sulaiman, and Hamad ibn Abi Sulaiman is the teacher of Abu Hanifa. Abu Hanifa's name is Nu'man ibn Thabit. He comes from a Persian family. He's Arabic speaking, but he comes from a Mawali family, a family of Persian converts to Islam. And his father is a silk merchant in Kufa, and he's raised to follow in his father's footsteps to be a silk merchant, and he actually becomes very good at it. And at some point, he doesn't have, throughout his childhood, he has no inclination to learn Islam, to study fiqh. But at some point, he's coming back home from the marketplace where he was selling silk. And along the way, he passes a man whose name is Amir al-Sha'bi. Amir al-Sha'bi is one of the great scholars of the city of Kufa. He's one of the students, another of the students of Alqama ibn Qais, along with Ibrahim al-Nakha'i. And he sees Abu Hanifa, and he has some connection with him, he has some knowledge of him, he's been watching him. He stops him and he says, Ya Nu'man, who is it that you often go and visit? Who do you frequent? And Abu Hanifa doesn't understand what this sentence means, because it has a particular meaning among the scholars. It means, who do you go and study with? Who's your sheikh? Who's your scholar, your teacher? He doesn't understand this, so he says, I go to the market. The place I frequent, the place I go to often is the market. And Amr al-Sha'bi says, you have a brilliant mind. He sees this in him, or he has some previous knowledge of him. Somehow he knows Abu Hanifa is an intelligent young man. He says, don't waste that selling silks in the market. You should study Islam. And this is a turning point for Abu Hanifa. He gets this attention from this great scholar. He sees something in him that he probably didn't see in himself. And he's telling him, study Islam. Don't waste this on something like just making money. Use this on something that's going to really bring light and beauty into this world. And so Abu Hanifa dedicates himself to the study of Islam. There's more to these stories. There's so much more to all of these stories. But ultimately, he dedicates himself specifically to the study of fiqh, and he becomes the student of, he's sent, Amr al-Sha'bi tells him, go and study with so-and-so. He goes and he studies with Hamad ibn Abi Sulaiman, dedicates himself to his teacher Hamad for the rest of his life, for the rest of Hamad's life, and continues on afterwards to become the greatest faqih of the people of Iraq. And from him will emerge the Hanafi school of thought. Numerous students that will come, that will study with him, that will learn the fiqh of Abdullah bin Mas'ud that he inherited, and that will continue to develop and advance that school throughout that region and throughout the Muslim Ummah. And today the Hanafi school is, by population, the largest madhab in the world. And there are so many stories that I would love to tell. This is a very dear topic to me when it comes to talking about the lives of the four Imams, because it was the topic that first introduced me and excited me about the study both of Islam and the study of Islamic history. And it was presented to me by the recordings of a lecture or a lecture series that was given by a Kuwaiti scholar named Hisham al-Awadi. I wish I could do what he does. I wish I could do what he did for me, which was to present the lives of these scholars in such a way that really makes you fall in love with them. I can't do that. I don't have the time, and this is not the kind of series to do that with you today, but I can recommend that you go out. His recordings are online. If you look up Hisham al-Awadi, if you look up the lives of the four Imams, you can find those there, and inshallah it'll have a greater effect on you than it did on me. We'll move on from Imam Abu Hanifa and talk about Imam Malik. Imam Malik is a contemporary of Abu Hanifa. Abu Hanifa is born in the year 699 and he dies in the year 767. Imam Malik is 12 years younger. He's born in 711 and he'll live until he's 83, so 795. So 84 maybe. He dies in 795, Imam Malik. Imam Malik is from the city of Medina. Imam Malik studies partially under a man named Imam Nafi'. Imam Nafi' was the servant and student of Abdullah bin Umar, the son of Umar ibn Khattab. And so Imam Malik is the inheritor of the fiqh of Abdullah bin Umar, and he becomes the great fiqh scholar of the people of Medina and develops the Maliki school. And I can't get into the fiqh because I am not at all educated in that way. But one point that's worth noting about the way that Imam Malik develops his school is he takes into account in the development of fiqh within his school, one of the principles that's used to determine fiqh within the Maliki school is the customs of the people of Medina. And partially we see from that a part of the nature of Imam Malik. Imam Malik loved his city, absolutely loved the city of Medina. He comes from one of the old families of the city of Medina. His grandfather was one of the scribes that wrote down the Quran under Uthman ibn Affan. And he's coming from this knowledgeable, scholarly family. His father was a great scholar, his uncle was a great scholar, his brother was a great scholar, but he eclipses all of them. He dedicates himself to ilm from a very young age, or really it's his mother that pushes him to study Islam from a very young age. And he very quickly emerges as one of the most brilliant minds in the Muslim Ummah. I wish I could go into more detail of the stories, but I can give a couple. When he's very young, he wants to study with Imam Nafi'. As I said, Imam Nafi' is the student of Abdullah bin Umar. Imam Nafi' is very old when Imam Malik is very young. He's a teenager at the time. He wants to study with Imam Nafi' because he wants to get the knowledge of Abdullah bin Umar before it passes away, before Imam Nafi' goes into the grave and takes all of that with him. He wants to get it firsthand. But he has a problem. Imam Nafi' is known for having a horrible temper. He was a knowledgeable, brilliant scholar, great Muslim, but just not somebody who really liked being around other people. He did not like people, and he particularly did not like children. And so Imam Nafi' refused to teach children. He had two rules. One, nobody was ever allowed to ask him a fiqh question outside of his class in the masjid. If he was not sitting in the circle, in the halaqah, teaching, you were not allowed to ask him a fiqh question. And two, children were not allowed to attend his circle. So Imam Malik, instead of saying, this guy hates people, he hates children, he's just a bad-tempered person, why would we want to learn from him anyway? Instead of going on Twitter and trying to cancel him, he goes and he devises a plan, because Imam Malik is brilliant, even from a young age. He devises a plan to get the knowledge from Imam Nafi'. He goes every day, he stands outside Imam Nafi''s home in the middle of the day, right before Dhuhr, when the sun is at its highest, under that hot Arabian sun, when the sand turns red from how hot it is, he would go and he would stand and he would actually hide around the corner from Imam Nafi''s home. And he would wait until Imam Nafi' left the house to go to pray Dhuhr, because he knows he's going to come out to walk to the masjid for Dhuhr. And then he would time it so that he would walk past Imam Nafi' and it would seem like an accident, that he just happened to be walking past him as he was leaving his house. And he would say, Assalamu alaikum. And as much as Imam Nafi' doesn't like kids, he's going to return salam. So he returns his salams, and Imam Malik walks on. And then Imam Nafi' would get to the masjid, and Imam Malik would time it again so that he enters the masjid right before Imam Nafi'. So as Imam Nafi' is going to the door, Imam Malik comes, and then he stops because he wants to let his elder in. They make eye contact, they say salam, and then he says, while I have you here, what is the answer to such and such a, he gives him a fiqh question. He just says, do you know what did Abdullah bin Umar say about making wudu? Or something like that. And Imam Nafi' would be caught off guard a little bit, and he would say, he said such and such. And then he'd go into the masjid. And Imam Malik would do this once a week, twice a week. He wouldn't do it too often. And he says, and this is we're getting these stories from Imam Malik, he's describing this himself. He says, I wouldn't do it too often because I didn't want him to catch on. But And he would do it every week, maybe every couple weeks. And throughout the course of a couple of years that their lives overlap, he manages to get enough of the knowledge of Abdullah bin Umar that he could fill books with the fatawa of Abdullah bin Umar taken from Imam Nafi' in this clever way. That's one of the stories of Imam Malik as a young man. Of course, he'll grow and he'll become the greatest scholar of the city of Medina and one of the greatest scholars of the Muslim Ummah. Imam Malik and Imam Abu-Hanifa represent one half of the four great Imams that we have. And the four Imams taken together represent a beautiful diversity of the Ummah. Because with Imam Malik and Imam Abu Hanifa, we have two very wealthy, very prestigious members of society. Imam Abu Hanifa is coming out of the family of a silk merchant, and he himself is and remains, even as a fiqhi, he remains a successful silk merchant. So he remains wealthy his whole life, extremely generous, extremely humble, but also very wealthy. And he comes out of one of the privileged positions in his society. Imam Malik is even wealthier than Imam Abu Hanifa, coming out of a very wealthy family, coming out of one of the noble families of the city of Medina, and he lives that way his whole life. Imam Malik had a position, a principle, that the scholars should be the most respected people in their communities. And so he always dressed the best of anybody in the city of Medina. He wouldn't go and teach in the masjid except that he was wearing expensive, beautiful clothing. We have this idea of the greatest scholars of the Muslim Ummah being people who wore nothing but wool, and they were always poor, and they always lived in small houses, and didn't want the wealth of the world. And that's true in some cases, and some of those people are the greatest people in our Ummah. But Imam Malik represents a different type of scholar. Imam Abu Hanifa had the same characteristic, not to the extent that Imam Malik had, but he would make sure that he dressed well, beautifully, that he made sure that when people saw him, they saw a scholar, they saw a person, that's someone I should immediately respect. Right? We're not going to look at our kings and our khalifas and our governors and think in awe at all of the greatness that they have and how wonderful they look, and then look at our scholars and think those are people I don't ever want to be near because they haven't showered in a week. These are people who took care of themselves, who used their wealth, who used the blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them in order to elevate the status of the knowledge that they were bringing to people. Imam Malik in particular made sure that people treated scholars with the respect that those vessels of the words of the Prophet ﷺ deserved. When somebody would come and ask Imam Malik a question, he would say, is this a question of fiqh or is this a question of hadith? If it was a question of fiqh, he'd give them an answer. If it was a question of hadith, he'd go back to his house. He'd take out his best clothing. He'd shower. He'd make ghusl. Then he'd put his best clothing on. Then he would put itr on. He would put perfume all over. Then he would light incense. And he would set up the room. And he would make sure that when they come in, they're hit by beautiful smells. And they're in a relaxing environment. And they're in a beautiful mindset, and they see this man whose hair is hinnad beautifully, who's well taken care of, well groomed, wearing beautiful clothing, and he would sit down, and then he would have them relax, and then he would recite the hadith to them. Because he would say, these are the words of the Prophet ﷺ. You don't pass somebody by in the street and say, Qala Allah, Qala Rasul, such and such, and that's it. He would say, no. The words of the Prophet ﷺ, you want fiqh, I'll give that to you wherever you want. You want the words of the Prophet ﷺ, that's going to come with an aura. And Imam Malik always came with an aura. That's the person of Imam Malik. The lives of Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik occur mostly during the time of the Umayyads. And both of them face some of that oppression that I was talking about that comes from the Umayyad Empire. And like I said, I can't give the full background here, The Umayyads do many, many great things. But when it comes to our Sahaba and when it comes to the lives of our scholars, we're going to see a lot of very not so great things, right? A lot of terrible things that occur. But one of the things that the Umayyads are dealing with, as we said, there's all this resentment against the Umayyads. This is the time period that they're living in. And there's a lot of question among the Umayyads and among the Ummah about the legitimacy of the Umayyads, right? Are they legitimate rulers? So the Umayyads are paranoid about their legitimacy, constantly looking for affirmation. And the people are always looking to the scholars. People don't go to the Khalifas like we tend to think today. If we had a Khalifa, all of our problems would be solved. People didn't take their problems to the Khalifa. If the borders needed to be protected, if a welfare program needed to be developed, if the state needed to be managed and safeguarded, that's what the Khalifa did. But if you have a problem in your life, if you're suffering with something inside of you, if you want someone to pray for you, if you're having a problem with your children or your spouse, you're taking the most vulnerable aspects of yourself to the scholars. And the Khalifas know that. The Umayyads know that. They know that the love of the people is with the scholars. So the Umayyads are always leaning hard on the scholars to support them, to tell the people that we're your rightful rulers, to make sure that they're not supporting anybody who might be thinking to make a move against them. And this becomes very relevant in the lives of Abu-Hanifa and Imam Malik. Both of them, at different points in their life, are offered qadi positions, official state judge positions. You would be an employee, essentially, in those positions. As lofty position as that is, you would be part of the state apparatus. So Abu Hanifa is offered the position of the qadi of Iraq. He's going to be the chief judge and justice of the people of Iraq. And Imam Malik is offered the position of the qadi of the people of Hijaz, the people of Mecca and Medina. These are extremely, extremely high positions. They come with a lot of prestige. They come with a lot of wealth. They come with the full support of a powerful government. And both of them refuse. They don't want to be a part of that. They're not going to lead a rebellion against the Umayyads. They never make statements telling people that they should fight against the Umayyads, that they should overthrow this dynasty. But they don't want to be bought by their rulers. They want to be independent. They want people to know that when you come to me, you're not getting an answer that's been approved by this governmental structure. You're getting the knowledge of the Prophet ﷺ. That you're getting the teachings of the Quran. You're getting the word of Islam. Both of them refuse. Both of them at different times are taken into custody, arrested by the soldiers of the Khalifa, and to one extent or another even tortured, beaten. Abu Hanifa was known for being very beautiful. When he comes out of the palaces, when he's finally released for his refusal to become a judge, and he comes out of the palaces of the governor of Kufa, there are scars on his face, and he said, the thing that scared me the most when they were punishing me was that I knew that if they scarred my face, it would upset my mother. And when his mother sees him, she holds his face, she starts to cry. Right? And Imam Malik goes through a similar situation. He's taken to the prisons of the governor of Medina because he refused to become a judge. And the Umayyads, to them, you refuse a political offer, you're sending a message to everyone that you don't want to be a part of us. And they become paranoid that everyone's going to interpret that as you think we're not legitimate rulers. So they want to force these scholars. That's why they do this. That's why they take them into the dungeons. That's why they punish them and torture them. They want to force them to say, no, you're going to send a message to everyone that we are the legitimate rulers. Of course, this always backfires. Rulers never seem to get that. So Imam Malik is thrown in jail by the governor of Medina, and he's tortured so much so that they say both of his arms are dislocated from his shoulders. It's a joke. This is not at all true, but there's a common joke among fuqaha that that's why Malikis pray with their arms at their side. It's not the case, but it's a moment of humor to lighten something very heavy. And he's held in prison for weeks. And the people of Medina is a tight community. Medina is a city that loves its scholars, and they love Imam Malik. And the people of Medina start to protest. They stop going to work, and they all start gathering outside, and they say the whole city of Medina shuts down, and the whole population of Medina is gathered around the palace of the governor, and the governor becomes afraid. And he starts sending messages to the Khalifa, even though it was the Khalifa that told him to arrest Imam Malik. He's sending messages to the Khalifa saying, I'm afraid the city's about to revolt. I'm going to get killed. So finally the Khalifa sends a message to the people. He says, I'm so sorry, this was the governor, it wasn't me, I didn't tell him to do this. He fires the governor, he says, I'm going to take care of everything. He releases Imam Malik, he gives Imam Malik gold and wealth, and fires the governor, and the people of Medina finally calm down. This is a relationship that we see between our great Imams and the Khalifas. And I don't want to leave us with this idea that the Khalifas were just terrible, oppressive rulers. But we do have to sit with this concept that the Khalifa wasn't in every generation this shadow of the Prophet ﷺ, who was always benevolent, and throughout all of these generations of Muslims that came before us, things were beautiful and peaceful, and you were living under a Muslim state, and that meant that there weren't any problems, and nobody was persecuting anybody, and Muslims always got along with each other. That's not the history of political Islam. You want that history, you want the history of beautiful characters, of people who had iman and had taqwa and had belief in Allah and were pious and were righteous and had great character. That's the history of the scholars. And we have both of these streams in our ummah. And we have to follow both of them. We have to understand where they both lead and how they connect and how they depart from one another. And we're going to keep coming back to this point over and over again throughout our series. I know I only got through 2 of our 4 Imams. We'll talk about Imam al-Shafi'i and Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal in the next lecture, inshallah. And we'll continue on following those streams as far as we can. And we'll leave it here. Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum.
I have a question. Is it true that Imam Malik was born?
Imam Malik is called Imam Malik al-Ashraq. He's called the fair one. Ashqar, thank you. I don't think I did this, and I was immediately corrected by my parents, as they're supposed to do. A couple weeks ago, we had a couple-week break. That was mostly because of my wedding, and I wanted to, or I should have last time, introduced my wife to the community of Madison. I love this community, and and she has become my primary source on Arabic words. So, he was called Al-Ashqar, right? Which means the fair one, which can mean somebody who's blonde. In this case, it actually means somebody, he was very light-skinned. And he was known for that in the city of Medina, and that was his nickname from when he was a boy. And so even up until his late age, he still retained that nickname. So
Sheikh Osama, are you ready for my question?
I think so, inshallah.
Okay. So the first interesting point that you brought about al-jizya, and I think it is very important because no matter how far we are in history, this term, this subject still comes up to us. Whenever we have a conversation with a person from a different faith, you know, it's used, and it's mostly used against us. So even though this incident about the group of Christians who came to become Muslim at that time, 800 years ago, I think it's still relevant and important to learn about that incident and have an answer especially that we are giving the information about that specific Khalifa. I don't know who he was from the Umayyad Khalifa. He refused or reject their Shahada. And the way that you were telling the story, my understanding from you is because he was suspicious about their coming to Islam because they were trying to avoid just paying the jizya. Okay, so maybe he did not see the sincerity in them. I would like more clarification on that.
Inshallah,
So
yeah.
That's the first one. I still have two more. Is that okay?
Let me answer that
Okay,
because I will forget it
Okay.
if I don't. I need to go back and look at the details of that story in particular. It wasn't a Khalifa, it was a governor,
Okay.
and I don't remember the name of the governor there at all. But the response from the ulama is that the body of that story and the message that we're getting there. And the response there has nothing to do with the sincerity of those people, because the principle of Shahada is you don't gauge the sincerity of the person. That's actually part of the legal framework that this governor is operating in. It's not his place to gauge. And also, it's well known that one of the goals of jizya is to encourage people to become Muslim. So even if, and this was a very well-known thing, people would become Muslim all the time to avoid paying jizya. But the point of many of the presentations of Islam is that we're so confident in the truth of what we're bringing to people, we don't really care how people come to Islam. Because if they sit with it for long enough, and this is a story that we see at Fath Makkah, with all the people who we know became Muslim because they were forced to. We know Abu Sufyan, his story in detail. He tells us himself, he became Muslim because he knew if he didn't, he was going to be killed. He was pressured and forced into it. So that's part of the whole thing of the whole concept behind jizya. So with this particular governor, and I don't know the details of what happened in that particular story, other than that it's used as an example. Him gauging the sincerity of these people is not part of that. It doesn't factor in as any kind of legitimacy to his claim.
There was a dark moment in our history that he just...
Yeah, and it's a moment that comes up again and again. Alhamdulillah.
Okay.
We have a question here. I want to just get a few more questions and I'll come back, inshallah.
There's also the famous story from when the Prophet was setting out for the Battle of Badr, that a pagan king wanted to fight with them because he wanted the Ghanima, the loot.
Yeah.
And the Prophet said, if you become Muslim, you can fight with us. And then he said, I don't want to become Muslim, I just want the loot. And the Prophet said, then don't fight with us. And so he left, and then he ended up coming back and saying, all right, I'll be Muslim. And the Prophet accepted it. So I think his sincerity might have, at least at that point, been questionable, but we can see from the Prophet's example that he wasn't interested in judging the man's.
Yeah, Islam has a very rich history of this idea of we do not litmus test. We don't ask people for signs of the purity of their faith. This is a really important idea for us as believers. It's a very important theological aspect, but it also plays an extremely important role politically. And it leads to a very different kind of civilization than the relationship that people have here today with the concept of citizenship and whether or not you're accepted by a state and how the official relationship between you and the state that's protecting you. It's a very different world that exists. All you had to do to be under the protection of the state of the Khalifa was be under his protection. You were in his territory, he was responsible. There wasn't a citizenship application test. Citizenship as a concept didn't exist. You didn't have to do something in order to earn that from them. That was their responsibility on you. Right? How it was practiced and to what extent varies from place to place and time, but that's part of it. And then to go a step further, if you want to be a part of that ummah, that gets you those extra privileges, all you have to do is take the shahada. It leads to a very different world makeup than the one that we see today. Muhammad.
So, in terms of like the imam that's leading prayer, how did people occupy those positions? So, like for example, Imam Malik lived in Medina. Would he be the one leading Salah at Masjid Nabawi?
So, there's a couple of points to that. Under the Umayyads, no, let's back up. The way that masajid functioned was a little bit different than we're used to seeing masajid function in at least America today. You see something more like this in Middle Eastern countries, where you had every city was required. This was a legal requirement of the construction of Muslim cities. Every city had to have a jami'ah. A jami'ah is a particular type of masjid. It's a masjid that can hold the entire male population of a city. That was its requirement. So it had to be a large masjid, depending on the size of the city. And of course, we're not talking about cities the size of Chicago, right? We're talking about much smaller cities here. But when you're looking at something like Baghdad, which isn't built yet in the time period that we've been talking about, but will be built soon, that gets to a population of 1 million people, right? And the Jami'ah was massive, right? Had to be able to hold the male population of the city. That's the requirement of a Jami'ah. And a Jami'ah is where you pray Jum'ah. So every Jum'ah, people would go and they would all pray Jum'ah in the Jami'ah of whatever city they happen to be living in. And so one person is giving the khutbah, right? And one person is leading the salah, and one person is more or less responsible for salah in that masjid, right? Your 5 daily prayers would be prayed in any of the numerous small masajid that are scattered throughout the city. So you have this kind of layout of the masjids, the masajid of a city, where you have the big one that everyone prays Jum'ah at, and then you have the small neighborhood masajid. In the small neighborhood masajid, it was whoever was the local imam of that masjid. Sometimes it was a political position if it was, an important district of the city. Usually it was whatever was being locally done by the community, the local community there. In the big masjid, that's a political position, right? And so under the Umayyads, it was actually the Khalifa who was responsible for giving the khutbah and leading the salawat. Right? This is actually from the Khalifa al-Rashidin. Under the Khalifa al-Rashidin, they give the khutbahs in the masjid, in the jami'ah of the city that they're in. Right? This would be the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ in Medina. Right? And they lead the 5 daily salawats. And the Umayyads continue that practice, and then under the Abbasids, they stop that practice. Because when we get to the Abbasids, as much as we like to attack the Umayyads, they could actually lead salah. By the time we get to the Abbasids, many of their khalifas probably couldn't give a khutbah at that point. So I don't know if that answers your question.
So in terms of like the position of the imam of the Jami'ah, that was appointed by the Khalifa.
That's an appointed political position by the Khalifa. So generally speaking, it would not be Imam Malik at his time. Yes?
My question was a little more clarification about bay'ah in general. So during this time of the Umayyads, how was bay'ah given, or was it given at all, or was it forced on people to give bay'ah to the Khalifa at that time? How did that happen?
I'm not an expert in this field by any stretch of the imagination. But basically, the basics of bay'ah are, one, bay'ah is not every person is giving bay'ah. Bay'ah is something that's taken from the leaders. So to some extent, the scholars were asked to give bay'ah, and then definitely the other political leaders. So if you have other people within the family, once it gets kind of restricted to the Umayyad family, and you have the Umayyad dynasty, and then you have the Abbasid family and the Abbasid dynasty, bay'ah really gets restricted to the other people within that family who might want to take it. Right? It's basically becomes an oath at that point that I'm not going to steal this from you later. Right? Still, people would, some scholars would still be required throughout history. But there's the idea is that everyone is giving bay'ah, but you're not actually being required to go and give it. As long as you're not coming out and saying, I do not give bay'ah to this person, there's this kind of tacit understanding that you are giving bay'ah. That becomes part of the problem with Imam Malik. At some point, he gives a fatwa. Somebody comes to him and says, if you're forced to marry someone, and is that a real marriage because you were forced to do it, right? And Imam Malik says no, right? He says, the Quran says, La ikraha fi din, you cannot force people in this religion. So if a marriage is forced on someone and you never accept it yourself, then that is an invalid marriage. It doesn't exist. Right? The Umayyads immediately take that to mean that that's a hidden message, that he's saying because everybody is pretty much forced to just by default give bay'ah to them, that they're not actually giving bay'ah to them. And that's part of one of the things that leads to him getting arrested in the first place. So bay'ah becomes this very complicated issue, but in terms of like practicality of how it was actually done, for the most part it was restricted to the people within the family who were actually vying for the position.
We'll take one more, just for time.
Okay, let me get two more because a couple of them have had their hands up for a little bit.
So thank you for taking my question.
Yes.
So during the time of the Khilafah, there was Sharia implemented, right? So my understanding is while I was looking into that, in order for the Khalifa to implement Sharia, hudud has to be established first, in terms of punishments and stuff. So there were two things like had and ta'zir. Had I understand, but ta'zir I try to understand what it exactly means, but my understanding is not clear about it. So if you could shed some light on ta'zir.
I wish I could, but your understanding of ta'zir is probably better than mine. I couldn't give you a definition at all.
Ta'zir is a punishment that is determined by the Khalifa or the Qadi himself according to the situation.
Okay.
So it's not a had, it's a gray area. Wherever he sees suitable as a punishment, he would just do that. That's what ta'zir is.
So had is a punishment that's established by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Here's the punishment that you have to do according to this, and it's a whole other complicated thing. Really what it is here's as much as you can do to punish this particular action. And the relationship that has with the role of the Khalifa is actually a huge discussion. The different madhahib take different positions on whether or not the Khalifa is the one that's responsible for had punishments. Most say he is, but then we have this kind of interesting history. We'll talk about it when we get to the Ottomans, because it's really under the Ottomans that this shows up, or at least that I was exposed to it in their history. While you have a certain set, it's 5 had punishments that the Hanafi madhahib said that the Khalifa is responsible for, and the Ottomans are Hanafi. I think only 3 of them are ever implemented. We'll talk about that more when we get there, inshallah. Such a good question that I couldn't provide an answer. Allah bless you.
Do you have one more?
We have one more, but somebody up here has had their hand, and then I will talk, inshallah. Yes.
Last but not least.
Alhamdulillah.
So, you mentioned something a little bit curious when you said that Imam Malik had his shoulders dislocated, and maybe that's the reason why the Malikis pray with their arms down. That was obviously a joke.
Yes.
But what is actually the reason why that Madhab prays like that? And I've seen it among some Ibadis as well, and then among some Shiites too.
Yeah. I don't know the specific. If somebody else knows, I'd love to know. I don't know the reason that's given there. I know that a lot of what you see in the Maliki madhab has to do with, or one of the, as we mentioned, one of the main principles of the Maliki madhab is the local culture of the people of Medina. That's one of the ideas within the Maliki madhab. Fiqh can be derived from studying the culture of the people of Medina, because Imam Malik's rationale there is that these are especially at his time, he's born in 711, the Prophet ﷺ dies in 632. He's coming just a couple generations after the Prophet ﷺ. So when he's in the city of Medina, these are the children and the grandchildren of the Sahaba. So for him, his argument is, if you look to what these people are practicing, they're going to be practicing what their parents taught them, and their parents are practicing what they learned from the Sahaba who learned it from the Prophet ﷺ. So that the city of Medina becomes this kind of preservation of the actual look of the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, because these are people who were watching that. I don't know specifically about this, but that's part of the principle behind Imam Malik's school. Mason.
So basically, there's a hadith that say that the Prophet ﷺ said that if you want to see how the Prophet prays, look at Ibn Zubayr, and then from there's other narrations that say that Ibn Zubayr didn't put his right over his left, he let his arms hang down.
So to answer this question,
Yeah.
and that's from Sheikh Hassan Baby, I think he taught us that a long time ago. I can't remember all the details, but it was related to Anas ibn Malik was beaten up at a certain incident, and when he came to the prayer, actually his arms were hurting, so he couldn't really put his arm in this fashion. So he did the isdal, and people interpret this as something that he's implementing in his teaching and his madhab, but it wasn't. It was just an incident and people just built on that. So the point that Sheikh Hassan was trying to tell us that the traditional way of actually standing in the prayer is by putting your arms, hands like this, and if it was not misinterpreted by the followers of Ibn Malik, they would have been doing the same thing.
Yeah, so ultimately what we're left with is that idea there are different, even here in our audience here, right, there are different interpretations, there are different reasons that are given for these things, and that's what we get from these four Imams, and that's what we get from the whole of scholars that are